Megan Williams just wanted to grow a simple flower garden, but her HOA president, Mark Henderson, turned it into a battleground with unjust fines and threats. Using his power for personal gain, Mark thought no one would dare stand up to him. But Megan had a secret weapon: determination, a sharp attorney, and a community ready to rally behind her. And wait until you hear how this fight for justice took a shocking turn and ended with an unforgettable victory. The morning sun poured through the kitchen window as Megan Williams sipped her coffee, enjoying the peaceful hum of her new neighborhood. Life in the charming California suburb had seemed like a dream when she bought her modest house 6 months ago. The front yard, now bursting with vibrant lilies, roses, and marigolds, was her sanctuary. Every flower told a story. Her grandmother's advice to plant with your heart lived in every petal. But that morning's peace shattered when she opened her mailbox. A crisp white envelope with the HOA logo in the corner caught her eye. Megan tore it open, her curiosity quickly replaced with disbelief. The letter declared that her flower bed violated the approved aesthetic standards of the neighborhood and demanded its removal within 14 days. To make matters worse, there was a $500 fine for non-compliance. Megan sat down at the table, her hands trembling as she reread the letter. She glanced out the window at her garden, now a symbol of rebellion. How could something so beautiful, something that neighbors had complimented, be labeled a violation? Determined to resolve what had to be a misunderstanding, Megan called the HOA office. The person on the line spoke in a clipped tone, transferring her to the HOA president, Mark Henderson. His voice was as cold as the letter. "Megan," he began, "your flower bed is disruptive to the visual harmony of the neighborhood. It needs to go." "I don't understand," Megan replied, struggling to keep her tone even. "There's nothing in the HOA rules about flowers being a problem. Can you point me to the specific clause I'm violating?" Mark sighed, the sound dripping with condescension. "It's not always about what's written. It's about maintaining a uniform look. If you don't comply, the fines will increase, and we'll take further action if necessary." Megan felt a mix of anger and disbelief. Further action? Over flowers? "Rules are rules," Mark snapped, cutting her off. "Either remove them or the fines keep coming. End of discussion." The call ended abruptly, leaving Megan staring at her phone. Her garden, a small patch of joy and connection to her late grandmother, was now a battleground. Her mind raced with questions. Was this personal? Why was Mark so dismissive? That evening, Megan walked through her garden, her fingers brushing against the petals. Neighbors strolled by, offering their usual warm greetings and admiring her flowers. One elderly woman paused, leaning on her cane. "Your flowers brighten up this whole street," she said with a smile. "Thank you," Megan replied, the compliment bittersweet now. "Not everyone seems to think so." The woman frowned, but said nothing, walking away with a knowing look. Megan's frustration boiled over. If Mark thought she would quietly back down, he was wrong. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Megan made a decision. She would fight this unjustified fine and protect her garden. For her, it wasn't just about flowers. It was about standing up to a bully who thought he could steamroll her. Unbeknownst to her, this was only the beginning of a much larger fight. The weekend arrived with an unusual tension in the air. Instead of tending to her beloved flower bed, Megan spent her time poring over the HOA's rulebook. The crisp pages felt heavy with legal jargon, but she combed through every section, determined to find the clause that Mark Henderson had so adamantly referred to. Hour after hour, Megan searched, her coffee going cold and her patience wearing thin. Finally, her suspicions were confirmed. Nowhere in the rules was there any mention of restrictions on flowers. A flicker of hope reignited within her. Armed with the document and a newfound determination, she decided to attend the upcoming HOA meeting to confront Mark directly. The night of the meeting, the HOA's community center was buzzing with murmurs. The dimly lit room smelled faintly of old carpet, and the rows of folding chairs filled with residents created a tense atmosphere. Megan felt the weight of every gaze as she walked in, clutching her binder of evidence. At the front of the room stood Mark, exuding an air of authority. His polished demeanor and confident smile contrasted sharply with the storm of emotions brewing inside Megan. When the meeting reached the public concerns section, Megan raised her hand. "I'd like to address the issue of my flower bed," she began, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. Mark's smile faded, replaced by a look of irritation. "Ms. Williams, this has already been discussed. You're in violation of our aesthetic guidelines." "With all due respect," Megan interrupted, holding up the HOA rulebook, "I've reviewed these guidelines thoroughly, and there's nothing here that prohibits planting flowers." The room fell silent. A few neighbors exchanged glances, their curiosity piqued. Mark cleared his throat, his tone sharpening. "It's about maintaining a uniform look, Megan. We can't have everyone planting whatever they want and disrupting the neighborhood's image." "Disrupting the image?" Megan repeated, her voice rising slightly. "These flowers don't harm anyone. They add color and life to the street. Why is that a problem?" Mark's composure cracked for a brief moment. "The rules exist for a reason. If you continue to defy them, the fines will only increase. And if necessary, we'll escalate this legally." The room buzzed with whispers. Megan scanned the crowd, noticing a mix of reactions. Some nodded in agreement with Mark, while others looked uneasy. One voice broke through the tension. "This isn't the first time HOA has gone overboard," said an elderly woman seated near the back. All heads turned toward Doris, a longtime resident known for her sharp wit and no-nonsense attitude. "Mark, remember when you tried to fine me for putting up solar lights? That was overturned too." Mark's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Megan felt a swell of gratitude toward Doris, who winked at her. Despite Doris's support, the meeting ended with Mark reaffirming his stance. As Megan left the room, she overheard snippets of conversation. Some neighbors quietly expressed their sympathy, while others avoided eye contact entirely. By the time Megan got home, a new letter from the HOA awaited her. The fine had increased to $1,500, with a warning that further non-compliance would lead to legal action. Sitting on her couch, Megan felt the weight of exhaustion pressing down on her. But as she glanced out the window at her vibrant garden, the colors seemed to whisper a promise. This fight wasn't over. She wasn't alone anymore. Doris's words and the subtle glances of support from others reminded her that justice might be slow, but it was within reach. Megan woke up with a new sense of purpose. The soft morning light filtered through her curtains, illuminating the vibrant garden outside. The flowers seemed to whisper encouragement as she brewed her coffee. Sitting at her kitchen table, Megan opened her laptop, determined to find a way to fight back. This wasn't just about flowers anymore. It was about standing up for herself and the neighbors who might face similar treatment. Her first call was to an attorney, Claire Bennett, a sharp and compassionate professional known for taking on cases against overreaching HOAs. Claire listened intently as Megan recounted her story, her voice steady but tinged with frustration. "Let's start by gathering every document and piece of correspondence you've received from the HOA," Claire advised. "If there's a pattern of abuse or manipulation, we'll find it." Megan spent the next few days compiling evidence. Her dining table transformed into a makeshift war room, papers and folders spread out in neat piles. Late one evening, as she sifted through old HOA newsletters and emails, Doris knocked on her door, holding a dusty box. "These are from my years dealing with them," Doris explained, setting the box down with a knowing smile. "Mark's been pulling these stunts for years, but most folks don't have the time or energy to fight back." Megan's heart swelled with gratitude. Together, they combed through Doris's documents, uncovering a trail of questionable fines and vague policy changes. It became clear that Mark had been exploiting his position for personal gain, using fines as a steady revenue stream. The breakthrough came late one night. Megan found a scanned letter buried in Doris's files, addressed from Mark to a contractor. The letter outlined a plan to funnel extra funds from HOA fines into a discretionary account for neighborhood improvements, a term vague enough to cover anything. Megan's jaw dropped as she read the line. "We can use these fines as a steady source of additional income if framed correctly." "Gotcha," Megan muttered, her frustration tempered by the sweet taste of vindication. She immediately forwarded the document to Claire, who confirmed its significance. The next morning, Claire suggested taking the fight public. Stories like this resonate with people. HOAs are supposed to protect communities, not exploit them. Let's make sure the world knows what's happening here. Megan hesitated. She wasn't used to the spotlight, but the thought of letting Mark continue unchecked steeled her resolve. She reached out to a local journalist, Jason Green, who had previously covered HOA controversies. Within days, Jason was at her door with a camera crew, eager to document her story. As the news segment aired, Megan watched nervously from her couch. The reporter's voice narrated the details with clarity and conviction, showing the damning evidence Megan and Doris had uncovered. The camera panned over her colorful garden, a stark contrast to the sterile arguments Mark had made about uniformity. The community's response was immediate. Neighbors began voicing their support, emboldened by Megan's bravery. Some shared their own stories of unfair treatment by the HOA. Mark, however, was silent until a reporter confronted him outside his office. His polished demeanor faltered under the barrage of questions, and for the first time, Megan saw him look vulnerable. Megan turned off the TV and leaned back, exhaling deeply. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time she felt the tide turning. The weight of injustice was no longer hers to carry alone. The courtroom buzzed with quiet anticipation as Megan took her seat. At her side, Claire Bennett was calm and composed, her files meticulously organized. Across the room sat Mark Henderson, visibly tense, though he tried to maintain his usual air of authority. The judge entered, her expression unreadable but firm. "Let's begin," she said, her voice cutting through the tension. Claire started strong. "Your Honor, this case is about misuse of authority. My client was fined for something as harmless as planting flowers. The evidence will show that Mr. Henderson has abused his position for personal gain." As Claire presented the case, the mood in the courtroom began to shift. She laid out every detail from the vague HOA policies to the pattern of unjustified fines. The crowning moment was the letter, Mark's private communication about using fines for extra revenue. "Mr. Henderson," the judge asked, holding up the letter, "how do you justify this?" Mark fumbled, his confident demeanor faltering. "It was taken out of context, Your Honor." The judge's sharp gaze didn't waver. "The context seems clear. You've imposed fines unfairly and disregarded your community's trust." When Doris testified, she described years of similar actions by Mark. Her calm, detailed account solidified the case, and Megan couldn't help but feel a surge of gratitude. Finally, the judge delivered her verdict. "The fines imposed on Ms. Williams were illegal and are hereby nullified. The HOA will pay her $10,000 in damages for undue stress. Furthermore, Mr. Henderson is removed from his position effective immediately." Megan's heart raced as relief washed over her. She turned to Claire, who smiled. "You did it," Claire said softly. In the following weeks, the HOA underwent significant changes. New policies promised fairness and transparency, and neighbors began to reconnect as a community. Megan's garden stood untouched, a symbol of resilience. Every bloom felt like a victory, a reminder that standing up for herself had made a difference, not just for her, but for everyone. The early morning sun bathed Megan's garden in a golden glow, making the dew on the petals shimmer like tiny jewels. She stood on her porch, a cup of coffee in hand, and took in the sight of her colorful flower bed. It felt like the first time in months that she could truly breathe deeply. The garden wasn't just a patch of earth with plants anymore. It was a symbol of freedom, resilience, and justice. Neighbors strolled by, some stopping to admire the flowers. "Looks even better now," one of them said, giving Megan an approving nod. "Thank you," she replied, her voice warm but humble. She couldn't help but smile. The battle had been exhausting, but moments like this made it worthwhile. The changes in the neighborhood were already noticeable. Inspired by Megan's courage, more residents had begun attending HOA meetings, voicing their concerns and demanding transparency. The once intimidating board now operated under close scrutiny, and discussions felt more like collaborative conversations than lectures. Doris stopped by later that day, holding a pie as a token of gratitude. "You've done something incredible," she said, her eyes shining. "I've lived here for decades, and I've never seen people so united." Megan chuckled, setting the pie on the kitchen counter. "I just wanted to keep my garden. I never imagined it would lead to all this." Doris smiled knowingly. Sometimes, standing up for the little things makes the biggest difference. Later that evening, Megan sat in her garden, the soft hum of crickets filling the air. She reflected on the journey, the fear, the frustration, and finally, the triumph. Her victory wasn't just for herself, it was for her neighbors, for anyone who had ever felt powerless against unfair authority. As the stars began to dot the sky, Megan made a quiet promise to herself. If there was ever another battle to fight, she wouldn't hesitate. But for now, she allowed herself to rest, knowing she had done something that mattered. Her flowers swayed gently in the breeze, as if nodding in agreement. This was more than a new dawn for her. It was a fresh start for the entire community. Together, they had proven that even against the odds, justice could prevail.